Pflanzen können hören, wenn Fressfeinde im Anmarsch sind. Sie fischen für uns wertvolle Metalle aus dem Boden, nach denen wir bisher aufwendig graben. Und Computer sind letzten Endes genauso Teil unserer Ökologie wie Bäume und Käfer. James Bridle lockt uns mit wahrlich unkonventionellen Ideen aus der gedanklichen Reserve und verführt uns in seinem neuesten Buch dazu, ganz neu auf die Welt zu blicken. Ja, James Bridle, es ist gar nicht so einfach, Sie vorzustellen. Sie haben einerseits Kognitionswissenschaften und Informatik studiert. Sie schreiben über Technologie für ganz unterschiedliche Zeitungen und Zeitschriften, für den Guardian, für den Atlantic, für Wired. Sie schreiben tolle Bücher und Sie sind auch in der Kunstszene bekannt, international gefeiert. Sie passen eigentlich in keine Schublade.
No, which is probably why I've written a book that's all about how categories don't really work anymore. And that they're a poor method for thinking about the world. I've always found myself in places where I don't quite fit, kind of between disciplines, whether that's studying computer science while still mostly having an interest in literature, or working in book publishing while actually thinking that maybe the internet and computers were kind of interesting and weren't here to destroy us. And I think that probably is the biggest characteristic of my work. Is that I like to kind of jump between disciplines because that's where all the interesting conversations seem to happen.
Und Sie sagen ja auch, das ist eigentlich der richtige Blick auf die Welt, dass wir sehr viel umfassender eben auf die Welt blicken. Waren Sie schon als Kind so, dass Sie sich für 1000 unterschiedliche Sachen begeistern konnten?
I don't know. It's often there's this idea that this stuff is born quite deep in childhood, but I think a lot of my life has been shaped by my childhood, but I don't think that's a particular characteristic of it. I mean, the strongest influence on my work, I think, is being part of that particular cohort that came of age the same time as the internet, right? That's kind of what I think about as someone, you know, and there's quite a narrow band of people born around the same time as I was born, between sort of 1975 and 1985. We're not magic or special, but we just happened to grow up really with the internet, and that the internet arrived at a kind of critical point of adolescence for us, that we were able to see a little bit of life before it, see the early internet as it existed, see the way that it changed, and the effect that it had on our lives. And so I consider myself part of a kind of cohort, as I said, that had that effect. And that, I think, and again, it didn't have the same effect on everyone, but for me, it gave me a kind of totally different perspective on the world as something that I could explore and find out more about in the most, you know, basic, simple way. And I think I've carried that attitude with me throughout, while also, you know, really kind of transferring it to other things, to understand that, like, a new thing, a new way of seeing, a new ways of thinking can arise at any time in from very unexpected places, and that it's possible to seek those things out.
Und Sie haben ja auch an sehr unterschiedlichen Orten schon gelebt. Sie waren lange Zeit in London zu Hause, einer pulsierenden Metropole. Heute leben Sie auf einer Insel nahe von Athen, also in Griechenland. Und auch Ihr Buch beginnt in Griechenland. Und zwar an einem geschichtsträchtigen Ort in Epirus im Nordwesten Griechenlands, an der Grenze zu Albanien. Ein Ort, an dem es schon zu Kämpfen kam um 1940 herum. Da waren nämlich die griechischen Truppen damit beauftragt, Mussolinis Armee zurückzudrängen. Sie haben schlussendlich gewonnen und auch heute werden da wieder Kämpfe ausgefochten. Allerdings, und das schreiben Sie im Buch, in einer ganz anderen Art und Weise. Es geht nämlich darum, dass da Erdöl abgebaut werden soll. Und es gibt viele zivile Organisationen, die sich dagegen wehren. Das ist ja erst einmal ein interessanter Kampf, weil Griechenland könnte dieses Geld der Erdölförderung ja extrem gut gebrauchen.
Yeah, Greece can absolutely use the income, unfortunately, which is why these battles are happening. There's been a pretty much unanimous position from the last several Greek governments on all sides of the political spectrum, as much as they differ, that they want oil and gas, and not just from the Epirus region, but also from the Mediterranean Sea. So there's drilling going on all the way down the coast and also around kind of Cyprus and these places, which is not Greek, but is closely tied to it. And this is the disaster that we're in the present moment, right? Because we all know that every drop of oil and gas that is extracted from the earth is damaging earth and the prospects of survival for us and every other creature on it. And it, you know, for me, a lot of my work comes out of finding myself in particular places where those issues become very real. And Ypres was one of those places. I'd heard that this was happening up there, and it was a place that I'd spent some time and that I love deeply. It's an incredibly beautiful place. And so understanding what was happening there, I went up to meet people who were more actively engaged in the fight against the oil and gas exploration. It was kind of campaigning against it, and unfortunately not very effectively, because that's not easy to do in Greece. The government's pretty powerful, and the companies had a lot of support. I just wanted to understand more and spend time in the place. But by being in the place, I understood also some of the mechanics around it. And as you know from reading the book, one of those things was to discover the ways in which oil and gas companies are using artificial intelligence to identify sites for oil and gas extraction, and to make that extraction more efficient. Essentially, to kill us and everything that else lives on the planet more effectively.
Und da schreiben Sie im Buch ja auch oder stellen eigentlich die ironische Frage, wie kann man von Intelligenz sprechen? Also Sie nutzen, Repsol nutzt künstliche Intelligenz. Wie kann man von Intelligenz sprechen, wenn es darum geht, etwas zu zerstören? Das zeigt aber schon, dass Sie einen sehr voraussetzungsreichen Begriff von Intelligenz verwenden. Also intelligent kann für Sie nur sein, was auch nachhaltig ist. Verstehe ich das richtig?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would suggest that there's a fundamental lack of intelligence in anything that destroys itself. I guess I would struggle to assign the idea of intelligence to anything that is dedicated to its own destruction.
Das ist interessant, weil ich würde sagen, es gibt wahrscheinlich schon intelligente Diktatoren zum Beispiel oder intelligente Sadisten.
I wouldn't. That's not the definition of intelligence that I would use. I think that they may be successful at being dictators or sadists, but I'm not sure I would call them intelligent. And that's not my... We maybe should step back and explore a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about intelligence, because really this was the question that I, faced up to in trying to write this book. Because I decided that I'd try and write a book about intelligence, not knowing very much about what I meant by that, of course. But that's the lovely place to start a process like this. And what I discovered, going back into other writings and thinkings about intelligence, is that historically what we mean by intelligence, or what we're always secretly saying when we use the word intelligence, we just mean like what humans do. Like you can get into all these other kind of questions around, narrow it down to all these categories of things like making plans, self-awareness, like various kind of abilities. You can take these kind of lists of different categories, you jumble them together, but there's no like single solid definition of what intelligence is. It's a malleable concept, and therefore a useful one, and one that's under debate. So you might consider those things you just mentioned to be forms of intelligence. I don't want to use that definition because I think it's useful to create other types of definitions, which is why they use artificial intelligence for things that I consider to be fundamentally stupid. I'm choosing my definition of intelligence because it's the one I think is productive and useful to use, which is why I don't want to use it for those other things. And that is also tied to my idea of what intelligence itself is, which is something that is active, that's something that is actually... a verb rather than a noun, right? It's not a static, fixed concept. It's something that emerges out of relationships. And so intelligence itself is something malleable and changeable. And so what we consider to be intelligent and value as intelligence can be changed with that as well.
Und ich glaube, das ist wirklich ein ganz wichtiger Punkt. Und ich wollte auch mit Ihnen natürlich über Intelligenz sprechen, weil Sie natürlich zu Recht sagen, wenn wir jetzt nur Intelligenztests nehmen würden, um Intelligenz zu messen, dann wären zum Beispiel alle Tiere und Pflanzen nicht intelligent. Und Sie haben einen sehr inklusiven Begriff von Intelligenz. Und wir werden später auch sehen, warum Sie denken, dass eigentlich die moralische Dimension schon in die Intelligenz eingebaut ist. Ein schönes Beispiel, was ich in Ihrem Buch auch gelernt habe, ist, dass wir sehr oft in der Diskussion über Intelligenz eigentlich von uns Menschen aus auf Wesen blicken und dann verpassen, was diese Wesen eigentlich können. Sie erzählen zum Beispiel die Geschichte von dem Gebrauch von Werkzeugen. Man hat gesehen, dass Krähen oder bestimmte Primaten Werkzeuge nutzen können. Das wird oft als intelligentes Verhalten angesehen. Und dann hat man sich gefragt, warum tut das der Gibbon nicht? Und Sie sagen, na ja, weil man eben plötzlich dann gesehen hat, die Hand des Gibbons, das ist eine Skizze in Ihrem Buch, sieht ganz anders aus. Der Affe, der Gibbon-Affe, der ist eben nicht wie der Makake in der Mitte ein Affe, der herumgeht in erster Linie, sondern er ist vor allem in den Bäumen hängend und hat deswegen eine ganz andere Hand und kann gar nicht Stecken aufheben. Das heißt, er kann nicht mit dem Stecken Futter irgendwo rausholen.
Yeah, I mean, that drawing's from a study where they basically tested the intelligent. They decided whether gibbons were intelligent based on whether they could find things that were hidden under little cups. And gibbons don't like picking up cups because they've got really long fingers and it's really hard. And also, plus on top of that, we're keeping them in cages and they don't like being in cages. And the whole setup of this system is an absolutely terrible way of evaluating something as meaningful and deep as the intelligence of another living being. The sticks example you gave is kind of a better, more favourite one of mine, because the other experiment, another type of experiment that's supposed to reveal the intelligence of other beings is, tool use. Given some kind of particular tool, can a creature work out how to use it to fulfill some kind of task, like reach for a treat that's out of reach? And for years, gibbons were not understood by the dominant science to be intelligent, because they wouldn't use these sticks that they were given. And people were giving them sticks for years, and they wouldn't use them. And they're like, why won't the gibbons use the sticks? And finally, someone redesigned the experiment in such a way that they hung these sticks from the top of their enclosures. And immediately, the gibbons just went, oh, thanks, like this. And like, oh, magically, they become intelligent within the lens of our understanding of intelligence. Right? Of course, they've been intelligent all along. They're just intelligent in a different way to us. And some of those ways of being intelligent, or rather some of those ways of doing intelligence, overlap with some of the ways that we do intelligence. Some of them totally radically different, many of them in ways that we will probably never see or understand. But intelligence is not something that exists solely within the head. It's something that exists both through the body, embodied in the way that the gibbon's embodiment includes the kind of long fingers and the reaching upwards because they live in the trees. And also it exists between bodies as a relationship, because it's something that's enacted in touch with the world.
Und interessant ist auch die vielen Beispiele, die Sie geben zu dem, was wir Schwarmintelligenz nennen, also beispielsweise Vögelschwärme, die sich organisieren, Krebskolonien, die gemeinsam Nistplätze suchen oder sich gemeinsam auf Wanderschaft begeben, oder die Bienen, die sich organisieren, wie man Futter findet, einander Zeichen geben und in Flugformationen dann auch unterwegs sind. Der Begriff der Schwarmintelligenz, der hat ja Eingang gefunden eigentlich auch in die Computertechnologie. Hat sozusagen die Computertechnologie den Begriff in der Tierwelt geklaut?
There are some examples, I think, of that I've heard about, where there has been like direct kind of inspiration from the more than human world into the technological. They're fairly few and far between. What seems to happen more often is kind of an interesting process of co-evolution. Kind of unconsciously, similar patterns arise within both because they're kind of found to be practical and successful in these various ways. For me, the greatest example, or one of the most fascinating examples of this kind of commonality between kind of patterns, essentially, of various forms within nature and within our technologies, is what you see happening in our kind of gradual awareness of natural fungal networks that have been found in kind of forests in the last decades or so. Not just in forests, they are a global thing, but people suddenly realized, certain scientists working very carefully, realized that the fungal systems of fungi connecting the roots of various trees were actually completely entangled with them and formed a communications network, an information and nutrient sharing network, where different species of tree could share food with each other, but also share information. They could warn about predators and so on and so forth. This system exists in almost all forests around the planet, in fact, in almost all soil around the planet. And it's something that the dominant science was kind of completely unaware of. And when it was first published, the first findings about this was published in Nature, they famously chose the title Wood Wide Webs as the title for this this issue of Nature, the scientific journal, because they knew that people had a model of communication networks in their heads already because of the existence of the World Wide Web, right? But also the scientists who discovered it, they were also some of the first people to be connected to the nascent internet back in the 1970s and 80s because they were because academic institutions were some of the first places to be connected to the internet. And so they too were kind of given a model of the world in the form of networks by this technology that had been created kind of separately. And that flipped over in turn again when information scientists started to study the internet in the 1990s. They realized that the network mathematics of the time wasn't really sufficient to cover it. And they had to invent a new kind of form of topology called network theory to describe what they called scale-free networks, which is how the internet works, where you have many, many nodes connected in many, many different ways, and you can kind of bring them in and take them out, and it doesn't damage the overall network. And it turns out that mathematics is directly applicable to the forest networks as well. They're not the same thing, very importantly. They differ in very, very important ways. But at the level of kind of metaphor, they have a huge amount in common. And there's a danger there as well, because, of course, we start to think of these things as being computers, and they're not. But there is definitely a kind of commonality of patterns between things that we consider to be natural, things we consider to be artificial, things that we make, and things that evolution has made, that can teach us something very, very important about the nature of the world and what we make.
Und das ist dann auch der Grund, weswegen wir zum Teil lernen können von der Natur oder wiederum von der Natur Sachen nehmen, um es in die Technologie einzufügen. Darüber werden wir sprechen. Jetzt, wenn wir kurz bei der Pflanzenwelt bleiben, Sie betonen im Buch an ganz vielen Stellen, dass eben auch Pflanzen intelligent sind. Dass Tiere intelligent sind, das würden wahrscheinlich die meisten noch teilen. Dass Pflanzen intelligent sind, ist für viele schon viel fremder, aber sie sind damit auch nicht alleine. Es gibt zum Beispiel Stefano Mancuso an der Universität Florenz, der sagt, Pflanzen sind sogar weitaus empfindlicher als Tiere. Und wir hören ihm ganz kurz zu.
Die Pflanzen sind viel empfindlicher als Tiere, denn sie können nicht flüchten. Ihre einzige Möglichkeit zu überleben ist, schon sehr viel früher wahrzunehmen, wenn sich etwas in der Umgebung verändert.
Geläufig ist das Beispiel der Mimose, die sich schützt, indem sie ihre Blätter bei Berührung zuklappt. Überraschender ist die Entdeckung amerikanischer Forscher. Eine Pflanze muss nur das typische Kaugeräusch ihres Fressfeindes in der Nähe identifizieren und schon produziert sie einen Abwehrstoff. Erklären lässt sich dies nur damit, dass Pflanzen Schallwellen irgendwie wahrnehmen können. Mancuso geht in seinem neuesten Buch gar so weit, den Pflanzen eine Intelligenz zuzusprechen, weil sie fähig seien, für ein Problem eine Lösung zu finden. Wie in diesem Experiment, in dem zwei Bohnenranken um dieselbe Stange konkurrieren.
Die erste ist am Ziel. Die zweite ändert sofort die Richtung. Sie hat das Rennen verloren und sucht eine Alternative.
Wettbewerb ist also nicht nur menschlich.
Die Pflanzen suchen nach Lösungen, sie konkurrieren, sie arbeiten auch zusammen. Würden Sie wirklich sagen, Pflanzen suchen Lösungen? Ist das nicht zu menschlich gedacht?
To say plants look for solution is a human thing to say because we're saying it in human language. You know, I mean, like we can't not understand things through a human lens because we are embodied as humans. That shouldn't be that should never be used to deny like the intelligence and embodiment of other beings. I have no problem with the idea of plant intelligence. It makes complete sense to me. In part, as I said, because I don't think intelligence is an interior quality. It's something that emerges. But because I believe in the beinghood of all beings. And therefore, these kind of arguments over the precise nature of what particular intelligence is involved here and how we should describe it in human language is you know, endlessly fascinating, but ultimately bunk, because the question is you know, it's the interesting question is never as like how much are you like me, but like what is it like to be you, right? Like what is the strangeness and difference that animates the world, not what is the thing that makes it all the same. And I think when we talk about the intelligence of other beings, that is so evident anywhere you look at the activity going on in the world around us. Like this constant desire to kind of nail it down to a specific set of qualities is, you know, is so fundamentally reductive. And it is is connected to a lot of our other ideas about how we should shape and build the world.
Sie haben vorhin diesen Begriff des Wood Wide Webs genannt. Und ich glaube tatsächlich, wenn man im Wald unterwegs ist, dann ist man sehr oft, also ich glaube, die meisten Menschen sind berührt von diesem Wald, von dieser Energie, die man da spürt. Man kann, glaube ich, sehr gut verstehen, was Sie auch meinen damit, dass Sie sagen, selbstverständlich ist Intelligenz nicht nur etwas, was in unseren Köpfen steckt, sondern es ist so viel weiter und breiter und vieles davon erfassen wir gar nicht. Es gibt manchmal aber doch auch Kritik. Sie haben jetzt gesagt, das ist eine rein sprachliche Kritik, aber es gibt manchmal trotzdem auch eine Kritik, dass wir vielleicht Prozesse überinterpretieren. Es gab gerade kürzlich ein Paper in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, wo Forschende gesagt haben, beispielsweise die These von Peter Wohlleben, einem deutschen Förster, dass Bäume ihre kleinen Bäume wie Babys stillen würden, indem dass sie ihnen Nährstoffe zufügen. Das sei eine komplette Übertreibung. Können Sie mit solcher Kritik etwas anfangen oder denken Sie, das ist eben auf der rein sprachlichen Ebene? Wir sagen stillen und das passt irgendwie nicht, aber grundsätzlich ist diese Zusammenarbeit immer da.
The problem here is that we're struggling with the language that is acceptable within the dominant system of science, that is capable of describing the world according to a certain set of circumstances, that is incredibly powerful and has allowed us to understand a huge amount about the world in a particular way. And I have no particular problem with that, but it is not the only way of understanding the world. The world does not exist only for its categorization within human knowledge systems. That is not the only way of experiencing the world. As you say, as anyone who has walked in a forest can tell you, and frankly, as most scientists will tell you as well. This is not, should never be framed as some kind of science versus hippie debate around who gets to call the shots on this, because that's ridiculous. Scientists, most of the scientists that I know, are some of the most inquisitive and kind of awe-inspired people that you could imagine. I think, the ones who I find particularly interesting are those who are able to hold these ideas conceptually within multiple kind of spheres of comprehension, multiple ways of knowing at the same time. A particular example of this that I write about in the book is the work of Monica Galliano, plant scientist who did the work that was mentioned in that clip on mimosa plants and their ability to remember, amongst many other interesting experiments. And Galliano writes very openly about having a shamanic practice, a practice in which she talks directly to plant spirits. And this really upsets a lot of scientists, as you can imagine, which is brilliant. Not that they get upset, but that these things get troubled. And the thing is, it doesn't matter whether you ascribe value or merit to her claims about not only that she communicates with plant spirits, but that those plants help her design her experiments, because her experiments, as constituted, conform to all the directives of the scientific method. They are reproducible, they appear in journals, they are peer-reviewed. They are good science, whatever you think about how the language that she uses to describe it.
Das ist interessant, weil Sie tatsächlich im Buch ja auch aufweisen, und das kann man tatsächlich überall auch nachlesen, dass Monica Galliano die ganz wichtigen Experimente mit den Mimosen beispielsweise gemacht hat. Sie konnte zeigen, dass wenn man eine Mimose 60 Mal hintereinander fallen lässt, dass sie mit der Zeit lernt, dass sie die Blätter nicht mehr schließen muss, wie wir es vorhin im Einspieler gesehen haben. Sie scheint sich also zu erinnern und scheint zu realisieren, oder irgendwie zu speichern, dass diese Art von Stoß keine Gefahr ist. Das konnte Monica Galliano tatsächlich nachweisen. Diese Studien wurden publiziert. Und wie Sie auch richtigerweise sagen, sagt Monica Galliano aber auch, der Begriff der Häresie, also der Irrlehre, wie Sie früher zum Beispiel der katholischen Kirche den Begriff benutzt haben, der ist natürlich dehnbar und im Laufe der Geschichte immer wieder auf anderes angewandt worden. Ich habe eine kurze Stelle gefunden aus einem TED-Talk, wo sie tatsächlich auch sagt, das, was sie tut, das wird heute manchmal ein bisschen so behandelt, wie früher hat man Giordano Bruno auf den Scheiterhaufen geworfen, weil er das kopernikanische Weltbild angegriffen hat. Und manchmal geht man so auch mit wissenschaftlichen Studien um, die nicht reinpassen ins herkömmliche Denken. Hören wir ihr auch ganz kurz zu.
Those who are at variance with the conventional wisdom, those are the ideas, the explanation, the expert opinion that everyone, the majority, accept as to be true, are still getting burnt. Maybe not at the stake, but certainly on the job market. And they're still feeling the heat of those flames, potentially burning down their careers. So the real question would be, so why do it? Why taking the risk? And well, because not doing it is actually far more dangerous. We will stop imagining other possibility. We will stop making other worlds possible.
Das spricht Ihnen wahrscheinlich ziemlich aus der Seele, oder?
Yeah, absolutely. But what I most enjoy about her work is the extent to which it troubles me as well. To the extent to which it makes me realise my own scientific, the way in which I've been conditioned into the Western dominant scientific worldview, that even though I too have spoken with plant spirits using not dissimilar methods, I still struggle to reconcile those two things. That I still instinctively cling to the scientific description of things. It's the one I still use primarily when I want to convince other people, for example, because I assume they have the same scientific conditioning as I do. And I still value that scientific thing, even though I have also had direct experience that doesn't counteract it, but is completely inexplicable within its system. And that's a very powerful thing. And it's for me, the most powerful thing, when we're capable of really deeply interrogating, recognizing when we are hitting the limits, not just of our own biases, but of the actual systems we have to think with, and how prepared we are to push beyond those explanations that we currently rely on. Not, as I say, to disregard them, but to recognize that there are simply other ways of doing this that are right here, waiting for us all along and crying out for our attention.
Und es gibt auch in der Philosophie ja diese Tradition. Sie beziehen sich auf diesen Begriff mehr als menschliche Welt. Das ist eigentlich das, was Sie in den Blick nehmen, die mehr als menschliche Welt. Und das ist ein Begriff des Philosophen David Abram. Er selber eben ein Philosoph, ein anerkannter Philosoph, aber auch er war ein Schamane zusätzlich, hat sich immer interessiert für diese Übergänge, diese unterschiedlichen Sichtweisen, Herangehensweisen. Und das ist genau das, was Sie auch interessiert, eben mit Blick auf Intelligenz. Und wenn ich Sie richtig verstehe, sagen Sie, wenn wir nicht aufhören, in unserem sehr engen Korsett auf Intelligenz zu blicken, dann entgeht uns ganz viel davon, was da draußen in der Welt auch an Potenzial ist, wovon wir lernen könnten.
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, as I described earlier, this way in which the way in which we've constructed, the technologies that we use every day shape the things, the ways in which we can think and consider the world. And the more we tie ourselves to particular systems of thinking, whether that's what in the past I've called computational thinking, which is thinking through computers, like thinking everything is possibly modelable and processable through ones and zeros and bits and pieces, or whether we restrict ourselves only to the scientific method. As soon as you make these frameworks, there are things that will fall outside those frameworks. And therefore we will miss out on them. And that is a form of violence that is being continuously done to the world that doesn't fit into those boxes. That happens within our societies, it happens at the edges of them towards other species, and it happens across the universe as well. And so the work is always constantly being to push against those frameworks. As I say, not to destroy them, but to make it evident that there are alternatives, that actually one can find kind of within the shadows and the edges of them whole other worlds to explore.
Und etwas, was unglaublich wichtig ist an diesem neuen oder ergänzten Verständnis von Intelligenz, ist, dass wir in Symbiose, in Zusammenarbeit eigentlich vorankommen und nicht so sehr auf unser eigenes Programm abspulen. Wenn wir noch einmal nach Epirus zurückgehen, kommen wir zu dieser Art von Pflanzen. Das hat mich wahnsinnig fasziniert, weil ich das noch nie gehört habe. Sogenannte Hyperakkumulatoren, die da wachsen. Hier Bornmüllera, hier das Mauersteinkraut. Pflanzen, die in der Lage sind, eben seltene Erden, Nickel zum Beispiel, Chrom, aus dem Boden herauszuholen. Und Sie sagen, im Grunde genommen könnte man so diese seltenen Erden aus dem Boden holen und eben nicht diese erdeverletzenden Bohrungen vornehmen, indem nämlich diese Pflanzen diese Erden rausholen, in den Blättern speichern, man kann die dann trocknen, verbrennen und die Asche, die da man hat, ist dann eben reich an seltenen Metallen, die sehr, sehr kostbar sind.
Yeah, isn't it amazing? So these are from the Alps. I know Bornmuela, I've met her before, but I don't know Marora Steinkraut.
Das ist sozusagen also die deutsche Übersetzung einer der Pflanzen.
Is it German for Alyssum? Is it Alyssum? I don't know.
Möglicherweise, ja genau. Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. So these are magic. I first met them in Greece, in Epirus, the same region we were talking about before. And yeah, as you described, they're hyperaccumulators. So they belong to this class of plants, not all of which are related, that perform this amazing work of drawing certain substances out of the earth. And yeah, they were first researched heavily in the 1990s by mining companies who were looking if they could deliberately plant them on polluted old mining sites because they would essentially remediate the soil and clean the soil. And they're really good at that. So we can collaborate with them in this way and invite them into places that we've despoiled and poisoned and beg them to, please, could you help us to clean this earth? And they're quite good at it and they like to do that, which is lovely, and we need to be very grateful to them for that. There's also this newer movement, which is what I was working with in Greece, which is called phytomining, which is growing these plants on naturally occurring metallic soils. So in northern Greece and Albania, and in a few other sites around Europe and in North America, there's places where there's a lot of nickel in the soil, and these are very poor agricultural soils. But these certain types of plants have evolved over millennia to thrive in these places by becoming hyperaccumulators, by, instead of being poisoned by the nickel, storing it in their stalks and leaves. The site that I worked with in Greece, the scientists there, they were working with three types of plant. They were working with Alyssum morale, they were working with Bornmuela emerginata, this one, and then a third type, Bornmuela tymphea. And it's worth understanding how and where those people, because we can talk about creatures as people, live. Alyssum occurs mostly around the Mediterranean region. Bornmuela emerginata is only found in northern Greece, Albanian, on these serpentine nickel-rich soils. And Bornmuela tymphea is named from Mount Tymphy, which is one of the highest peaks of the mountain range there, and it only grows within about 50 kilometers of the mountain itself. So they're all endemics, locally occurring plants of increasingly smaller ranges. Those are their homes. And they know their homes better than we do because they've lived there longer than us. And they have a form of knowledge of how to live well in those places. It's very interesting to know that we could grow and harvest them, and we could even do that quite sustainably, in that you chop them off close to the root. They continue to sequester carbon. They grow again. That's wonderful. We can be very grateful to them for that. But it would be an absolute disaster to presume that we could somehow keep up with our contemporary industrial life relying on their help to do that. Because the volume, we know from things like palm oil that as soon as you industrialize a process like this, even if it appears green at the outset, the scale at which it is required to do that for modern industrial civilization will destroy everything. And so, unfortunately, we will not be able to exploit them in that way, but then even those words coming out of my mouth being of course we shouldn't exploit them in that way because that would be a bad thing to do. We can learn from them. The main thing being to learn is that plants have knowledge that if we pay attention to might allow us to live differently, with less resources on the surface of the earth. But they're certainly not going to help us, and we shouldn't ask them to recreate the current kind of exploitative, extractive needs that we have in the present moment.
Und das Beispiel, eben wie Sie gerade gesagt haben, dient nicht dazu, jetzt zu sagen, wir können allen unseren Bedarf an diesen seltenen Erden so decken in Zukunft, sondern es dient dazu zu zeigen, Symbiose funktioniert. Pflanzen haben gelernt, sich anzupassen, und genauso sollte auch der Mensch lernen, sich seiner natürlichen Umgebung in einer Art und Weise anzupassen, wie es eben nachhaltig ist. Und ein Stück weit ist Ihr Intelligenzbegriff so umfassend, wenn ich das richtig verstehe, dass es darum eben geht, nicht zu trennen, nicht zu sortieren, nicht zu schubladisieren, sondern eben vereint zu denken, nicht vereinnahmend, vereint zu denken, über die Schranken hinweg zu denken und in Kooperationsverhältnissen zu denken. Und da sind wir eigentlich ganz nahe auch bei der sogenannten Gaia-Hypothese, eine alte Idee, vor allem bei Lynn Margulis und James Lovelock ist die ganz prominent vertreten worden. Und damit ist jetzt nicht gemeint, die ganze Welt ist beseelt, das gibt es auch, diese Vorstellung. Und manchmal wird die Gaia-Hypothese so verstanden, sondern was eigentlich gemeint ist, ist, auch die Welt ist ein Organismus. Und nur indem wir zusammenleben, haben wir auch die Möglichkeit, nachhaltig in ein Gleichgewicht zu kommen und diesen Gesamtorganismus namens Gaia irgendwie gemeinsam voranzubringen.
Yeah, it's organisms all the way down, whichever way you want to slice it. They're right down to the tiny, tiny flagellates that Lynn Margulis studied, and that proved, were the basis for her. The first things that Margulis was studying that gave the basis for her once much maligned and rejected and now overwhelmingly accepted theories of symbiogenesis. This idea that we basically became who we are, that everything became what it was through processes of kind of cooperation and coming together rather than from competition and splitting apart. She was working with with nucleus-less cells. She was working with the tiniest organisms that exist. But and the understanding expands from those tiny, tiny, tiny imperceptible specks of life all the way up to the complete ecosystem of the Earth. A way of understanding the Earth and everything on it, and probably actually the whole universe as a system of organisms that are relating to one another, and to which it's kind of really impossible to draw lines between. This is starting to become, I think, quite well known and recognised now, but it always bears restating. There was a famous paper that was published in, I think, Nature, one of the big science papers, 10 years ago now, that simply said there is no such thing as the individual. And what they meant was that microbiological study had reached the point where they couldn't find where the edges of a person were, because we're walking around with like 2 to 3 kilograms of other creatures on and inside us at all times.
Das verdrängen wir meistens.
Well, we shouldn't ignore it because it's incredibly important, and the mass extinction of species that is currently happening is happening inside our own bodies as well. We're losing some of our microbes, and those are microbes that make us healthy and alive. They're part of who we are. And so the 6th mass extinction already in process is happening within our own bodies as well. Those microbes, they are part of us in ways that make them inseparable from us, that don't allow us to draw a line between us and other species. The neurons that work in the brain that allow you to think, that make you, as we mostly understand it, who we are. Those neurons are made by processes that involve those gut bacteria. And in fact, if you change the makeup of the gut, people score differently on IQ tests. So we don't, the brain is not the only thinking organ.
Das ist mittlerweile wirklich ein großes Thema, dass sozusagen die Gesundheit des Darms und der Darmflora sehr stark zusammenhängt mit unseren gesamten Fähigkeiten, unserer Gesundheit. Und die Leute führen sich dann wieder künstlich Mittel ein, um die Darmflora irgendwie aufzubauen, weil genau wie Sie sagen, diese vielen, vielen kleinen Organismen in uns drin sind unglaublich wichtig.
It's very important, but it's also really important to stress that gut health is the health of the organism. And as I've said, it's organisms all the way down. Your gut health is the health of the world. Your gut health is influenced by the world around you and your environment. There is no boundary between the human and everything else that lives on this planet. Not at a molecular level, not at a biological level, not at the level of intelligence, not at the level of psychology. One of my favourite writers, Gregory Bateson, always talks about the eco-mental model, where he talks about the fact that when we drive, he talks about pollution as a form of driving the environment mad, in a sense, in a way that ultimately drives us mad as well, because we are part of the same system, just as we are part of the same biological system, in the way that the behaviour of different organisms in our gut who aren't us but are very intimately connected with us affects the way we perceive and think the world, affects our lives in all these incredibly deep ways. So the way that we treat the world affects our own health, which as soon as you say it sounds incredibly obvious, because of course we know that by polluting the world we damage our own health. But it's at the level of biology itself. We are made of the world. We are inseparable from it. And so the way we treat ourselves and the way we treat the world mirror each other, just as the way we think the world and the world thinks mirror each other.
Und James Bridle, ich kann mir vorstellen, ganz viele, die uns zuhören, haben eine große Sympathie, wenn sie zum Beispiel bereits sich interessieren für Umweltschutz, für Nachhaltigkeit. Es gibt eine große Faszination für alle diese Themen, eben die Intelligenz der Tiere, die Intelligenz der Pflanzen. Aber sie gehen einen ganz entscheidenden Schritt weiter, indem dass sie nämlich sagen, diese Ökologie, die ist so umfassend, da gehört auch die Technologie mit rein. Also es geht jetzt nicht darum zu sagen, wir sind alle auch Tiere und die Pflanzen und die Tiere interagieren und Pflanzen sind auch intelligent, sondern wir müssen Intelligenz so umfassend denken, dass eben die künstliche Intelligenz damit reinkommt. Und das, glaube ich, ist ein Schritt, den viele nicht machen würden, weil sie sagen würden, nein, ein Laptop, der ist unnatürlich, der gehört der künstlichen Welt an und ist komplett getrennt von dem, was wir in Pflanzen oder Tieren finden.
Nothing is separate from anything to do with plants and animals. I mean, how can it be? We're at a wood table. These things have been fused from sand. If we had a laptop in front of us, I would say that this laptop is made from the bodies of dead sea creatures who lived billions of years ago, whose bodies have been melted down, fused together to make the technologies we make every day. And it's animated by electrons that are probably also still being fired by the burning bodies of their compatriots, or at least directed by the sun or the wind or everything else. Nothing that lives upon the earth is separate from the earth in any way that has any meaning. And that's true of us, and it's true of the things that we make.
Aber
they exist within the same structures.
Da gehe ich absolut mit, muss man sich zuerst mal überlegen und zeigen Sie wunderschön auf in Ihrem Buch. Aber würden Sie nicht sagen, es gibt einen Unterschied zwischen diesen Pflanzen, diesen Hyperakkumulatoren, die seltene Erden aus dem Boden holen, und Repsol, die auch Metalle aus dem Boden holen? Würden wir nicht sagen, diese Art und Weise ist ein natürlicher Abbau von Metallen, währenddessen der andere künstlich ist?
We have to kind of stop using the word natural because it has no meaning. There is no state of nature from which anything is or can be separated.
Das ist
the
interessant.
nature was invented as a rhetorical device in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was done for reasons. It allowed a certain kind of thinking to emerge, but it's an entirely false distinction. There is no this idea that there is some separation between, that there is a nature that one can stand above or away from, is inconsistent and incoherent and does not apply. There is nothing between us and nature, and so there is nothing that can be unnatural. There is no outside to this system. It is a system of relationships, and we are all in constant relationships with everything around us all the time. They matter to our health, to our thinking, to the ways in which we perceive the world. They are our living being that we share.
Verstehe ich Sie auch richtig? Würden Sie sagen, es gibt nicht natürliche Intelligenz und künstliche Intelligenz, sondern es gibt nur nachhaltige Intelligenz und nachhaltige Intelligenz, also eben diejenige, die dafür sorgt, dass es weitergeht, dass dieser Organismus namens Gaia zum Beispiel weiterleben kann, das ist Intelligenz, und alles andere ist einfach nicht Intelligenz und nicht künstliche Intelligenz oder sowas.
I mean, I'm very resistant to setting myself up as the arbiter of what is or is not intelligent, or what particular type of intelligence any particular thing is. But I do feel very strongly that there is no such thing as artificial intelligence, because intelligence is not like a product in a test tube, or like a thing locked in the brain. It's not a consistent quality. It's a performance. It's a thing that is done. And therefore, anything that is doing intelligence is intelligent. And again, it can't be artificial, because nothing is artificial, nothing is natural, nothing is fake in that way. In the ways that we're discussing. So there are more interesting questions to be asked, possibly about why that intelligence is the way that it is, right? What role that intelligence is performing in the world? What are the systematic forces that shape that intelligence, that direct it? What are the structures that we have constructed in the world that both allow that intelligence to exist in the first place, that give it impetus and power in the present? What, in short, are the power structures that elevate one form of intelligence over another, or choose to recognize one form of intelligence over another? That, to me, is what is revealed by discussions of intelligence, not the level or the type of any particular intelligence, but the fact that intelligence operates through much larger existing systems of power and relationship that, on the one hand, lead us to consider one thing as being artificial or unnatural, or one thing as real and natural. These words have long political histories, and that's really what we're, I think, possibly edging towards here, is understanding that any time something is designated as natural or unnatural, or a number of other related terms, a very serious value judgment is being made in the language of power. And that allows certain things to be done to or with that intelligence. And that's what's being done with artificial intelligence in the present moment. That's very different to a question of whether something is intelligent or not.
Sie plädieren dafür, dass wir die Begriffe genau klären und noch einmal genau überlegen, was meinen wir eben, wenn wir über Natur beispielsweise sprechen. Das erinnert auch ein Stück weit daran, dass Ihr Buch auf Englisch ja Ways of Being heißt. Und für mich ist das eine Alliteration eigentlich oder eine Referenz an John Bergers Buch und seine Arbeit Ways of Seeing, 1972, der große Künstler und Kunsthistoriker, Autor. Und Sie haben selber ja auch auf BBC dann eine Serie gemacht über John Berger, New Ways of Seeing. Und im Grunde genommen geht es Ihnen immer wieder darum, eigentlich in diesem John Berger-Sinn, darauf Wert zu legen, dass wir dekonstruieren, wie wir Sachen anschauen und wie wir über Sachen sprechen. Bei John Berger geht es ja auch viel um diesen Male Gaze, also in der Kunstwelt beispielsweise, dass wir sehr lange in einer Art und Weise auf Frauenkörper geblickt haben und entsprechend die Frau so abgebildet haben in der Kunstgeschichte, wie der Mann sie gesehen hat. Das ist dieser Male Gaze, dieser männliche Blick. Und wenn ich Sie richtig verstehe, durchzieht das eigentlich Ihr ganzes Schaffen, auch in der Kunst, das Unsichtbare sichtbar machen und neu sehen lernen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do in this process. It's very much that attempt to... I mean, you said there's a desire to define these words. I don't think it's never a matter of nailing down language in particular forms, but it is to try and be as clear as possible what we're talking about, and to try and make it obvious that anyone, I think, as well, can see and think about these things. I think it's very easy in these discussions for this to become a language game, in which we're constantly trying to define something a bit more clearly or a bit more thing. When actually, one of the things I take from Berger, particularly, is a very strong belief that anyone can do this kind of thinking and this kind of looking at the world, because that's what Berger did in Ways of Seeing. He was taking the television medium in particular, extended back through the history of art, is using the tool of television to teach people how to see, and that has like a deeply democratic impulse behind it, which is that you too can look at art and think about it and get what you hear people getting from it, or you see people writing about and talk about art in this way. Anyone can do that. That these experiences really are for anyone, And you know, I think what I'm trying to do in this is just to communicate primarily experiences that I have had myself in thinking about these things and increasingly meeting these beings and all the other fun and exciting things that have happened. Because so much of this, particularly the technology stuff, happens within like very specialized domains. And in this case, within scientific domains. It's a real joy to write about science, even though I know I'm being very rude about it a lot this evening, because reading scientific papers is such a joy and a thing that very few non-scientists do. There's incredible things out there. It feels often like that public awareness, or public discourse is decades, if not occasionally up to a century, behind where so much scientific understanding is. You know, I think of, you know, we're over 100 years into the realization of the quantum world, and yet a true understanding of quantum physics has not really in any way impacted people's daily lives, even though it completely upends almost everything that we thought we knew about the universe, and potentially underlies much of what we're speaking about this evening. I just remain excited about those things. What more can I say?
Das Unsichtbare sichtbar zu machen, ist für Sie auch ein Anliegen in Ihrer Kunst. Es gibt ein Werk, das heißt Seamless Transition. Da machen Sie zum Beispiel verborgene Verhandlungsräume, in denen entschieden wird darüber, ob Migranten, Migrantinnen abgeschoben werden, machen Sie sichtbar. Und in dieser Sichtbarmachung steckt natürlich auch eine politische Botschaft. Denn sehr viele Dinge wissen wir ja abstrakt, aber wir haben sie nicht wirklich gesehen. Und es ist noch einmal etwas sehr anderes, Dinge wirklich wahrzunehmen.
Yeah, I mean, there's a project I'm very proud of. It came out of exactly the same sort of stupid curiosity that animates most of my other projects, in that I heard that the UK government was illegally deporting people in the middle of the night from regional airports. And so I got in my car and started hanging out at regional airports in the middle of the night and witnessed this happening, and found it quite bizarre that like no journalists were there, or that this wasn't a well-known thing. So I started making things about it and talking about it, which is how I work. And the work that resulted from that, which I'm still very proud of, was this project Seamless Transitions, which was a series of, I worked with the people who make those kind of glossy CGI visualizations for architecture. You know, when they're building a new building, it has the big picture of what it will never look like on the front of it. They're very good at what they do, so I worked with them because there were various spaces that I couldn't photograph because it's illegal to photograph within airports or within law courts in the UK, for example, where secret trials were taking place. So I went to the law court and we sketched it, and then we made these CGI recreations of them to show in the gallery. And I'm very proud of that project, and a lot of my work in that period did take that form of making, as you put it, and as others have, the invisible visible in these particular ways. And it's a very powerful thing to do, both with kind of secret, horrific government regime projects and with things like technology, where, particularly network technology, where the power of the network, who owns it, who runs it, where the money is like subsumed into this big thing we call the cloud that no one really knows what it is. But it's actually like massive buildings on motorways, and I go and photograph those as well. And all of that's important, but myself personally, I've actually kind of fallen a bit out of love with that as a way of working. I think it's fundamentally insufficient, in fact, to make the invisible visible. It's not enough, and I know this because I spent a decade doing it. That actually you can show people pictures of stuff all you like, and it makes no difference. They may go away knowing something they didn't know before, but what concerns me is their capacity to act in response to it. And actually just showing someone a picture of something, usually of something that they were probably aware was going on anyway. And this is the thing, there's this claim that there's some magic act that is performed when you show them the actual thing. It's like, oh, now you can't deny it. Humans are really good at denial, particularly if they feel that there is nothing they can do about that situation. And this is the really fundamental thing that I find myself mostly engaged with today, is not how you can create an awareness around something, because frankly, and I think this is particularly true of the ecological situation, we all know perfectly well what is going on. We don't need any more climate reports in, like campaigns in the media to convince us something is horrifically wrong. what we need is the tools, but also the capability to act. What I usually refer to as agency. Agency is the feeling, primarily it's a feeling, that you are in control of one's own life, that you can intervene in your life in meaningful ways and change it and in different ways, and thus intervene and change the world around you as well. Most of us lack agency. Because of the tools that we have to use every day that are shaped against us, the technological tools, we're also just not having the knowledge to act. And so what I mostly do now, instead of trying to teach to make things visible, is I try to teach agency in various ways.
Wie macht man das?
In like all kinds of ways. So for years I did it by teaching people to code. Not like in the way that government ministers say everyone should learn to code because we need like a healthy programming industry, but because learning to code turns a computer from being a television, a slightly interactive television, which is what a computer is to most people, into the most powerful tool that's ever been put into human hands, right? That you can actually manipulate the insides of this machine and all the machines connected to it in this most incredibly powerful way. Using even a small bit of programming in the right ways gives one an incredible amount of agency in the world. One feels that and responds to it, and then you act differently towards the systems around you. And that awareness is also transferable. Someone who has literacy in a particular area particularly strongly, and is also, or perhaps has it in more than one area, is then aware that that is a transferable skill. One can start looking at how to apply that agency in other ways. A couple of years ago, while having written my first book, which deals with how horrific aspects of the internet have become, and also the damage that it's doing to the environment, I found myself within my own personal kind of feelings of what's now mostly being termed climate trauma or climate anxiety. You know, there's just awareness that something is horribly wrong and not knowing what to do about it. And that being a thing that is trapping a lot of people in the present moment. You know, we're becoming more fluent in the language of trauma, I think, but one of the things that it does is it traps people into certain cycles of behavior, and it prevents us coming up with new behaviors or trying out new ideas. We need something to move us out of that state of trauma. And agency is one of the things that does that. I found myself like learning how to do simple solar installations, wiring up solar panels, started building windmills, doing these kind of odd things.
Sie werden eher Praktiker und nicht mehr so sehr derjenige sein, der dann Bücher schreibt.
All of these things, building a windmill, writing a book, building a website, each of them are things that I am learning to do. That's the process that I've understood that is common to all of them. I'm currently planning on building a house. I've never built a house before. It's on some level, it's absolutely terrifying. On the same thing, I've realised it is something that I can learn to do. Right? That's Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction writer's definition of technology, which I adore and love. She writes about technology because she was criticised as a science fiction writer for not writing about rocket ships enough. So she said, look, everything is technology. But actually what technology is what humans do, and therefore it is what you can learn to do. Everything is something that you can learn to do. And so agency for me is the conscious awareness that you can learn to do things. Because if you know that you can learn to do things, you can address them. And the anxiety and the trauma around things like climate change and many other aspects of your life become a lot more manageable when you feel that you can learn to change them. And that is something that can be encouraged in people as well.
Dann hoffen wir, dass wir dazu dann auch ein Buch erhalten, wie es funktioniert, selber ein Haus zu bauen. Vielen herzlichen Dank, dass Sie hier zu Gast waren, James Bridle. Dankeschön. Wälder und das Zusammenleben der Bäume faszinieren auch den Schriftsteller Richard Powers. Hier geht es zu einem Gespräch mit ihm. Und ob Pflanzen Bewusstsein haben, das habe ich auch den Starphilosophen David Chalmers gefragt. Hier zum Nachsehen. Mehr von den Sternstunden gibt es auf unserem YouTube-Kanal. Mit einem Abo verpasst ihr garantiert nichts mehr.